Intuition, said Gervase Fenn firmly. That's all it amounts to in the end. Intuition. He glared about the assembled company, as if challenging anyone to contradict him. But nobody did. It was his room to begin with, and they were all heavy with senior common room port, for which he had paid, so it seemed impolite to argue. Moreover, it was exceedingly hot, and Nigel, at any rate, felt little inclined to do anything but relax. It was 8 o'clock of a Friday evening, and only 3 hours ago he had completed the abominable journey down from town. He was tired. He stretched out his legs and prepared to absorb anything Fenn had to say on his favourite topic. The room was a large one, stretching the whole width of the southernmost parallel of the second quadrangle in St. Christopher's, and facing onto the garden on one side and the quadrangle itself on the other. It was on the first floor and was reached by a flight of steps leading up from the open passageway, which led through into the garden. Austerely but comfortably furnished, the cool cream of the walls, set off by the dark green of the carpet and curtains, was decorated only by a few Chinese miniatures, and by the meticulously arranged rows of books on low shelves which occupied every side of the room. On the mantelpiece were a few dilapidated plaques and busts of the greater masters of English literature, and a huge desk, its surface covered with an untidy melee of books and papers. This dominated the north wall. Fenn's wife, a plain, spectacled, sensible little woman, incongruously called Dolly, sat at one corner of the fireplace, in which a few embers glowed unnecessarily. Fenn himself sat on the other, while variously spaced between them were Nigel, Sir Richard Freeman, and a very old Don called Wilkes, who had attached himself to the party for no particular reason some minutes before. On his arrival, Fenn had been extremely rude to him, but then he was habitually rude to everyone. It was a natural consequence, Nigel decided, of his monstrous and excessive vitality. "Oh, and what can I do for you?" he had inquired, but Wilkes had settled himself down and demanded whisky with every evidence of a determination to stay long and leave late. "I'm rather sorry you've come, you know. I'm afraid you're going to be very bored with all these people." To whose degradation this remark was intended, it was impossible to tell. Wilkes, however, who was rather deaf, was not in the least taken aback by these comments, and merely smiled benignly upon all and sundry, and repeated his demand for whisky. Fenn got it for him with painful reluctance, and contented himself henceforth with uttering in a penetrating whisper various slanders against the old man, to the acute embarrassment of everyone except Mrs. Fenn, who was apparently quite used to it, and who said, "Now, Gervase," in an objurgatory but automatic manner every few minutes. It was getting dark. On the horizon 3 searchlights began to form their complex trigonometrical patterns, while in the quadrangle below a little clique of rowdy undergraduates was singing a student song to words not usually supplied in the printed versions. Sir Richard Freeman coughed disapprovingly as Fenn became launched on his logger-making. He had heard it all before, but Fenn was oblivious to such mild innuendos, and proceeded with irrepressible verve to enlarge on his ideas. "As I always tell you, Dick, detection and literary criticism really come to the same thing. Intuition, that miserable and degraded counter of our modern pseudo-philosophies. However, that is not the point. The point is that, to put it simply, the relation between one clue and another. I should say the nature of the relation between one clue and another occurs to your detective in exactly the same way, whether it be accelerated logic or some entirely extraordinary faculty, as the nature of a relation between, say, Ben Jonson and Dryden occurs in the literary critique." He paused rather dubiously, scenting perhaps an inherent weakness in this instance, but trod hotfoot over it and returned to the safer regions of abstract peroration. "Then, once the idea has occurred to you, you can work on substantiating it from the text, or from the remainder of the clues. You get led astray occasionally, of course, but there's always logic to confirm or refute you. It follows. But although detectives aren't necessarily good literary critics, and he waved happily at Sir Richard, good literary critics, if they bother to acquire the elementary technical equipment required in police work, are always good detectives. I'm a very good detective myself. In fact, I'm the only literary critic turned detective in the whole of fiction. The company considered this claim for a moment in silence, but any comment they might have wished to make on it was cut short by the sudden ringing of one of the telephones on Fenn's desk. He bounced to his feet like a jack-in-the-box and strode exuberantly across to it. The rest sat with that half-embarrassment which comes from being compelled to listen to a private telephone conversation. Wilkes began singing the opening theme of Strauss's Heldenlieben, which took him through 3½ octaves and resulted in the most extraordinary series of sounds. A ghostly echo of a wireless or gramophone carried on with it from somewhere outside, and it occurred to Nigel that Wilkes was not very deaf at all if he could hear that. Through the din, Fenn's voice was heard apostrophising the instrument. "Who?" "Yes, certainly, send him over right away." "That was the lodge. Robert Warner, the playwright, is coming up to see me. It will be nice to have the opportunity of hearing just what he feels like when he's writing, and how he sets about it." A general groan of dismay went up. Fenn's habit of cross-examining reluctant people about their jobs was not one of his more agreeable characteristics. "We literary critics must get down to fundamentals, you know." Wilkes. "Would you like to go now, Wilkes? I'm afraid you'll find this a little bit beyond you." "No, I would not like to go," replied the aged Wilkes with sudden asperity. "I have only just arrived. For heaven's sake, sit down, man. Stop fidgeting about." This so abashed Fenn that he sat, and openly sulked, until, a few moments later, Robert Warner came in. He greeted Nigel pleasantly and was introduced to the others, preserving a remarkable sang-froid, while Fenn bustled about finding him a chair and a drink, and offering him a box of cigarettes, half of which dropped on the floor. When they had finished helping him pick them up, they were all very breathless and red in the face, and sat in silence for a moment. This was unexpectedly broken by Wilkes, saying in a determined voice, "I am now going to tell you a ghost story." "No, no," cried Fenn. "That really is not necessary, Wilkes. We can, I hope, succeed in keeping the conversation going without that." "I think it will be of interest, not only because it concerns this college, but because it happens to be true. Furthermore, unlike the majority of true ghost stories, it is interesting and even a little thrilling. But, of course, if it will bore you—" "Certainly it won't bore us," said Sir Richard, attracting to himself a baleful glance from Fenn. "Personally, I need a little relaxation. I feel sleepy." "We all do," said Nigel. "I mean, need a little relaxation." "Then it will be agreeable to you if I go ahead?" Vague murmurs, quite undistinguishable. "You're quite sure none of you object?" More murmurs, perhaps vaguer. "Well then, excellent. Now, to a limited extent, this narrative is based on my own experience, yes. Well, I was an undergraduate at the time, towards the close of the last century. Time flies, does it not? Although the minor furore which the affair caused was kept very close indeed, I knew personally several of the people involved. There were, of course, no societies for psychical research in those days. They hadn't thought of it. Although Sidgwick and Myers did start one in 1882, but that had little credit. And I have the impression that if any investigation along those lines had been attempted, crucifixes and pentagrams notwithstanding, It could have done little but make a bad business into a worse one. Sometimes it's best not to talk of these things at all. As it was, the president of that time, Sir Arthur Hobbs, yes. He took the common sense view and did the common sense thing, though whether we succeeded in shutting it again, I suppose we shall never know. Certainly nothing of the same kind has happened since, but somewhere or other there may be a jack-in-the-box waiting for someone to slip the catch a second, no, a third time. He paused. Everyone looked blankly around at the other. Fen, who had begun by fidgeting, was now immobile. Sir Richard lay back with his eyes closed and his hands folded. Robert was listening attentively and smoking, but Nigel had the impression that a corner of his mind was occupied with more important things. Mrs. Fen was bent over her knitting. Wilkes went on. It began when they pulled down a wall in the antechapel, which, as you know, is situated at the north-east corner of the chancel in our college chapel. The whole of the chapel was restored at that time by a not very competent architect from London. Eventually it was left as we have it now. Certainly at the time the fabric was extremely unsound and could not be left, and on the whole there was little damage done to the original beauty of the building. In any case there was a certain up-and-at-it spirit in those days, which puts to shame our frantic, endless modern attempts at preservation. Symbolic, no doubt, of our consciousness of our inability to create new forms of art. The history of the college buildings is poorly documented. We had always been under the impression that the antechapel had been added by one of our presidents under Charles I as a burial place for himself and his very numerous family. Subsequently this proved to be correct, except that the antechapel turned out to be a rebuilding in part of an older place, possibly the robing room of the Benedictine monks, whose monastery originally stood on this site, and of which a few fragments still survive in the north quadrangle and the chapel. At all events, the removal of the facing from the north wall of the antechapel, which came down, the workmen said, with most alarming ease once start had been made, disclosed a much older wall, with a single rough stone slab set in the centre, and which could hardly have been later in date than 1300. Of course, this caused a great deal of excitement, and people interested in such things came from all over Oxford to look at it. The slab of which I have spoken had been inset a good deal later than the construction of the wall, and had on it 4 brief inscriptions, or rather 3 inscriptions and a later addition in indelible chalk or ink. First the date, 1556, which showed it to have been erected about the time of the martyrdoms. Then a single name, Johannes Kettenberg, the librarian. He was fairly well up in the college records, easily traced a reference to one John Kettenberg, a student of the college from 1554, who had been an enthusiastic supporter of the Reformation party, and who, as far as could be judged from a somewhat guarded contemporary document, had been hunted through the college by a band of infuriated townsmen and fellow students. He must have publicized his views rather too aggressively, I suppose. He was beaten to death against one of the chapel walls. You can have a look at the mark. And the document is available any time you like, though locked away, of course. What happens to the delinquents it doesn't say, but presumably in the circumstances there was little in the way of reprisals. One supposes the slab was set up as soon as the Anglican reforms were finally established, though there is no mention of that either. He paused again, and Nigel suddenly had a sickeningly vivid picture of a young man crouching like a hunted animal by the wall of the antechapel, of the breaking of the bones in his wrists and fingers, and of a final blow which smashed a corner of the skull and drove its jagged edge into his brain. Despite the warmth of the evening, he felt suddenly cold, and was glad of the comforting pressure of the broad armchair against his back. But it was the third inscription which was the most interesting. It consisted simply of the words Querum dum inveniam, which means, I suppose, I shall seek until I find it. While the fourth, scrawled in a much later hand, and apparently in a great hurry, was Cave ne exeat. Do not let it get out. Exactly. There was a good deal of excited speculation about the inscriptions, but no one could come to any definite conclusion, except that it seemed fairly obvious that the facing of the wall had been down once before, and that the fourth inscription had been added on that occasion. Nothing much happened for a day or two, except that the workmen showed an unaccountable repugnance for working in the antechapel. Also, the plaster dust which had been created by the demolitions showed little inclination to settle, although there was next to no draught in the chapel. It hung about in miniature fogs and clouds, seeming to get thicker and more obtrusive every day, so that the emergency services had to be given up altogether, much to the disgust of the chaplain, who had formed his own opinions on the matter, and who announced from his sick-bed that they had had at least a preventative value, but he was politely ignored. So we come to Mr. Archer, the Dean, an estimable man, very much in the intellectual vanguard of his time. His favourite reading, I imagine, was Gibbon on Christianity, and the more solemn parts of Voltaire, and not unnaturally he'd shown little interest one way or the other in the restoration of the chapel, only remarking sotto voce that he would not consider it any great loss if they knocked it down altogether. It seems that one evening I had this second-hand from a don who was intimate of his. He sat up late reading, and after knocking out his pipe preparatory for bed, put out his light, looked out of a window in the garden beyond. It was a windless night, with a few clouds and a pale anemic moon, to which I believe he quoted the appropriate lines from Shelley, and at once something unusual about the aspect of the place struck him. When questioned later, he would say he had the impression of a furious search. All over the garden bushes were thrust aside by sudden gusts of wind, and his eye, fascinated and horrified, traced an irregular movement from one side to the other, as if of something darting between them, which was too methodical and purposeful to be at all pleasant. It was fairly obvious that he was badly frightened, and it is much to his credit that he stayed where he was rather than go and find more agreeable company than whatever was in the garden. After a few minutes his obstinacy was rewarded. He saw a dark figure emerge from the bushes at the further end of the great lawn. It peered about it, and began to run at a tremendous pace towards the college. As the figure grew nearer, he saw it was Parkes, the undergraduate who was organ scholar at the time, and that his face was distorted with fear. He gained the building in safety, however, and when Archer looked up again, the garden seemed restored to normal, and nothing was moving. Only out of a corner of his eye could he see a glimpse of something white lying by the south side of the chapel, where it looks on to the garden. And when, with some reluctance, he put his head out of a window to observe it more closely, he saw that if there had been anything there at all, it was now gone. Well now, what was to be done? It was past 1 o'clock, and quite evidently Parkes had been using the less normal means of entry to the college, supplied by the tall crenellated wall at the bottom of the garden, and a disciplinary reproach on the spot, as it were, would provide an excuse for discovering what had frightened him so. I ought perhaps to mention that this was Vadine's room at the time, and that then, as now, the room below this, which Fellows has now, was occupied by the organ scholar." Fenn grunted. Nigel looked quickly out of the window at which Archer must have stood 50 years ago or more, and felt less comfortable than he would have believed possible. The room was very dark now, yet no one suggested turning on the lights. He very much wished someone would. Anyway, Archer went down to see Parks, and, to cut a long story short, found him pale and shaken, but with something of his confidence restored. He admitted quite openly that he'd stayed late at a beer party and come in over the wall, but when pressed as to what it was that had disturbed him, he became a good deal less coherent, and seemed very little inclined to speak of it. It seems that he had climbed the outside of a wall without any special difficulty, and Archer made a mental note to see about this, but that on jumping from the top of it into the garden, he'd found himself almost in the arms of something waiting there, and he could say no more of it than that there had been bones and teeth, and that a number of these appeared to be broken, and that it had moved shamblingly, dragging one leg behind it. This, he supposed, was why it had been unable to catch up with him. The short and the long of it was that Archer went back to bed again, a little worried at leaving Parks alone for the night, and not too pleased at being alone himself, but convinced that the encounter was a chance one, and that for the moment there was nothing more to be feared. The next morning Parks proved to be still sound in wind and limb, and even a little uppish about his adventure, since in the circumstances the Dean had thought it unwise to penalise him. Late that same evening, however, a terrible screaming was heard from his room. Naturally help was forthcoming immediately, with Archer well in the van, but it was too late. Yes, they found him lying, with his head battered in, though of weapon there was no trace. "Good God," said Sir Richard. "Murder, if you care to call it that. It seems that all his cries, which were distinguishable, considered of the one word, arche, which, if my memory serves me right, is Latin for keep it off. For why he should have spoken it in Latin, faced with what he was faced with, no one could imagine. He was not even a classical scholar. It can only be supposed that he had been impressed by the inscriptions found in the chapel, and in fact he had shown a keen interest in them, and that after his adventure of the night before had thought the phrase a kind of talisman in case another such meeting should take place. It was, I think, established that the word does play an important part in the goetic ritual of exorcism. He may have imagined it to be of some use. Heaven knows it let him down badly. Was anything ever discovered? There was a police investigation, but nothing came of it. The coroner's jury returned a verdict of murder by person or persons unknown. And what's your opinion? I tend to be of the opinion of the college authorities. And after only a very brief consultation, they ordered the wall to be covered up again, which was quickly done, and the anonymous 18th century warning transferred to a little plaque on the outside, which is there now. The librarian, by the way, discovered a brief record of the earlier demolition, made to facilitate the erection of a tomb, and it appears that apart from the actual death, something of the same sort happened then. I asked the chaplain, a man who had a healthy respect for the foul fiend as well as his more normal preoccupation with omnipotence, what he thought the object of the search was, and he said, "There is a reference in the Bible to one who goes about seeking what he may devour." "And nothing further occurred?" asked Robert. "No, except that to everyone's surprise the Dean began to attend chapel. He ended his life, I believe, a staunch churchman. Oh, there's one thing which perhaps I should mention. In the document which gives the account of the killing of John Kettenbell, the ringleader is mentioned as being one Richard Pegwell, who was organist at the time. But whether that has any bearing, I couldn't say. They sat in silence, while Fenn did the blackout and turned on the lights. Robert slipped up to him and made a whispered inquiry as to the whereabouts of the nearest lavatory. "Bottom of the stairs on the right, my dear fellow. You will come back, won't you?" "Of course. I shan't be a moment." "A very pleasant story," said Sir Richard. "Or conversely, a very unpleasant story. What did you think of it, Mrs. Fenn? I'm sure you're the most sensible one of us here."
"Oh, I thought it was a very good story. Very well told, Mr. Wilkes. But it sounded, if you'll forgive me, a little too neat and artificial to be true. As Mr. Wilkes said, real ghosts appear tedious and unenterprising, though I'm sure I've never come across one myself, and never want to." She resumed her knitting. Fenn gazed at her with something of the triumphant and sentimental pride of a dog-owner whose pet has succeeded in balancing a biscuit on its nose. "That's exactly my opinion." Then, somewhat suspiciously, he said, "How is it I've never heard this story before? You haven't been making it up, have you?" Rather to Nigel's surprise, Wilkes shook his head. "No, I haven't been making it up. There are still a few people alive who can confirm it. It was kept pretty quiet, as I said. It's probably why you haven't come across it." "And do you think there's any chance of the thing getting out again?" asked Nigel rather shamefacedly. In the blaze of the electric light, the remark sounded a good deal more foolish than it would have done a few minutes ago. But Wilkes treated it seriously. "Not in the same way, perhaps. People are still scared of bags of bones, but they believe that one way or another they can understand them and deal with them. So possibly it'll happen another way. It is the killing, after all, which is the essential thing, however it's contrived. Killing always engenders more killing. That is to say, that the debit account is never wiped off. And John Ketterber has, when you come to think of it, a great many scores to settle. So I dare say that some day, somehow—" And that was the moment they heard the shot. The room had grown so quiet that for a moment the noise of it seemed deafening. It was only when Nigel had recovered from his initial stupefaction that he realized it had come from below, Donald Fellowes' room. In conjunction with the story they'd been hearing, it was not an inspiriting sound. Even the phlegmatic Sir Richard sat up sharply. "Is that some of your fool undergraduates messing about? Then? If it is, they are going to hear about it." "Oh, you wait here, dear," he said to his wife. "I shall go and find out what's happened." "I'll come with you," said Sir Richard. Me too," said Nigel, ungrammatically. Fenn's wife nodded and went on with her knitting. Wilkes said nothing, but stared absently at the dying embers of the fire. As they left the room, looking, as Nigel said afterwards, very determined and grim, Sir Richard took out his watch and turned to Nigel. "What time do you make it?" 8:24 exactly." "Right. We've been about a minute so far. 8:23 is near enough." "Aren't you anticipating rather, sir?" "It's as well to know." They followed Fenn down the stairs. At the bottom they met Robert Warner, who was coming out of the lavatory with a ludicrously anxious expression on his face. "What on earth was that din? It sounded like a shot." "That is what we are going to find out," said Fenn. "I think I'm right in saying it came from in here." The door of the sitting-room on their left, which had the inscription Mr. D.A. Fellowes in white over the top, was ajar. Fenn pushed it open, and they all followed him in. The room presented nothing of particular interest. Like most college rooms, it was scantily furnished, and the only unusual feature was a grand piano to the right of the doorway. To the left was a screen, intended presumably to trap draughts, which, as Nigel well remembered, tend to be numerous in the majority of college rooms. But a cursory glance failed to discover anyone or anything concealed behind it. Over by the far window on the right was a small, flat-topped desk. A table, with one or two uncomfortable chairs, stood in the middle of a threadbare carpet, and the fireplace over on the left was flanked by a couple of chintz-covered armchairs. The only other item of furniture was an enormous bookcase, which contained on one of its shelves a few lonely-looking volumes, and on another a large pile of music, hymn-books too, anthems and services. The walls, which were disagreeably panelled in dark oak, were scarcely relieved by a few very small reproduction modern paintings, and in the dusk the general effect was one of profound gloom. But the room was typical of many such, and as it had no occupant, Donald Fellows or any other, Nigel gave it no more than a brief glance, and hurried on after Fen and Sir Richard to the door in the wall opposite, which led to the bedroom. This also was ajar, and entering they found themselves in a cold, comfortless, coffin-shaped room, furnished even more sparsely than the sitting-room, but for the moment they had eyes for none of these details. For beside the doorway stood a man, looking down at Usiette Haskell, who lay on the floor with a black hole in the centre of her forehead, and the whole of the top part of her face blackened and scorched. Like most people, Nigel had often tried to imagine how he'd feel in the presence of violent death, and like most people he had thought of himself as being calm, collected, and maybe even indifferent, so the conscious part of him was totally unprepared for the sudden acute spasm of nausea which seized him at the sight of that motionless, lifeless form. He went quietly back to the sitting-room and sat down with his face in his hands. Through the uncontrollable whirl of his thoughts and suspicions, he heard Sir Richard say, with a politeness which he remembered thinking excessive, "Would you please tell me who you are and what you're doing here?"
Yes, of course, sir. The professor will confirm. The name's Joe Wilkins. I've been working on repairing the stonework in the archway opposite. I was just down in tools to make off home, and I hears this bloody... Oh, begging your pardon. I hears a racket, sir. Well, I hops in here as quick as lightning to investigate. I must have only been a minute for you, gentlemen.
You haven't touched anything, have you?
No. I had a good deco round, this room and the other. There ain't no one hiding in either of 'em, unless in that wardrobe there, and you can be sure I kept my eye on that. No one's come out of this room since I've been here. It's right, ain't it, Professor? Yes, Williams is all right. He's been employed in the college for years on odd jobs. I don't think he's liable to fits of homicidal mania. No, not me.
Turn the light on, then.
Blackout. Oh, blast the blackout. We mustn't touch anything. Nevertheless.
So reluctantly they drew the curtains.
"First thing we must do," said Sir Richard, "is telephone the police. Where's the nearest telephone?"
"In my room. The lodge will put you through. Oh, you'd better tell Wilkes and my wife what's happened. But don't let them come down here. Tell Dolly if she likes to wait a while, I'll be up as soon as I can. Wilkes had better go home, you nuisance."
"Don't touch anything, for God's sake, Fen."
"I never would."
"Now, Williams, you'd better go across to the lodge and wait there. We shall want you for questioning later."
"Right, I will. Hour and a half before they close yet. Perhaps you can get me over first. Tell Parsons, on my authority, to see you get some beer from the buttery." "Oh, thank you, sir. Yes, I shall." "Oh, well, if it isn't Mr. Blake. How are you, sir, after all this time? Well, it's very good to see you again, I'm sure. How are you?" "Fine, Williams, thank you. And you?" "Well, it might be worse, sir, it might be worse. Just able to sit up and take nourishment, as you might say." "Nasty business, this, sir. She's a pretty young thing, too. Friend of Mr. Fellows. I seen her come in here several times afore. Only 20 minutes ago she come in here. She gave me a good evening, pretty as you like." "You saw her come in? That may be important." "Oh, no doubt about it, sir, no doubt about it." "Well, I mustn't talk about the case before police get you. Not that they'll have much of a job. I mean, it's clearly suicide, plain as mustard." "You think so?" "What else could it be? No one came in or out of the room. Certainly not for the last half hour, except her. And she couldn't have been shot through the window, 'cause it was shut when I arrived." Nigel felt a profound feeling of relief sweep over him. He was glad no one else was involved. Such a pretty, polite girl, I always thought. No care in the world. Well, I must be getting along. See you later, sir, no doubt. One man at least has retained his illusions about Usiette, thought Nigel bitterly. There must be few of her acquaintances who would be sorry to hear her dead. He wondered where Donald was and how he'd take the news. Then he went and joined the others, though for the moment he carefully refrained from looking again at the body.